All right. I hate starting episodes by saying all right. I'm going to try to get a little bit more comfortable or intimate or personal, whatever way you want to say it, with these podcast episodes. I think a lot of the ways I've approached the first 100 or so episodes has been very sort of robotic at times, not very personable at times. And I think I was just trying to get a feeling for how to create this podcast in a way that was most conducive towards learning. And so I feel like I've gotten into a good groove of how much to read and then when to reflect on trying to reflect and make sure I'm adding my own perspective into it. It started off with me wanting to always try to connect it back to Rockford in some kind of a way. And even though I still try to do that as regularly as possible, it's not as much of an emphasis on it anymore. I think the thing that I've learned the most throughout these episodes is that one of the most important aspects of reading, for this podcast specifically for reading, is being able to communicate and start a dialogue and articulate how some of these things are relevant to us in 2022 or whenever you may be listening to this, and the issues that we're facing in the realm of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. All right, with that being said, let's begin Chapter 10, Political Policing. The police have always been political. The roots of political policing lie deep in the desire of kings and queens to maintain power in the face of the shifting allegiances and interests of nobles and foreign powers. Today, states portray their police forces as value-neutral protectors of public safety, but in reality, states continue to monitor and disrupt all kinds of political activity through surveillance, infiltration, criminal entrapment, and repressing protest. The continued existence of these practices poses a major threat to any effort to change the basic role of the police and, more broadly, to achieve the goals of racial and economic justice. In a dictatorship, it is easy to see that the police are a threat to democracy and the forces of civil society, fulfilling a primarily political function. Crime control is always secondary. Repressive regimes in the post-colonial countries of Africa and Latin America rely on uniformed and secret police to harass, intimidate, and murder their political opponents. So-called civilian police in places like El Salvador and Guatemala are riven with a history of torture and extrajudicial killings. Dictatorships in Brazil and Argentina, quote, disappeared, end quote, tens of thousands of labor leaders, artists, and political opponents in thousands in the 1970s. Today, even semi-democratic regimes still rely on the police for primarily political functions. Nigerian police, for example, are notoriously ineffective at crime control. Most units are poorly paid and trained and frequently rely on torture, extortion, and unlawful detentions. But in semi-democratic Nigeria, political intelligence and riot control units tend to be the most desirable and prestigious assignments and are regularly implicated in the suppressions of social movements and opposition political groups, as well as vote rigging and vote suppression. India, while more democratic, has a police force primarily concerned with political management. After independence from Britain, it retained colonial forms of policing, with their emphasis on political surveillance and riot control to suppress industrial actions, ethnic conflicts, peasant uprisings, and guerrilla movements such as the Naxalites. Efforts to deal with crime and everyday public safety have been consistently sidetracked in favor of beefing up intelligence gathering and developing more sophisticated systems of suppressing political activity. The only units to receive extensive training and resources are intelligence and riot control divisions. Corruption and low wages for regular units remain endemic. Rural police are usually under the control of local agricultural elites who rely on them to maintain control over the vast rural poor, especially the lowest, quote, scheduled, end quote, castes and ethnic minorities. Police are routinely implicated in atrocities against such groups. Everyday policing is characterized by the release of politically connected or rich suspects and the torture and imprisonment of those unable to secure their release through bribes. Police are specifically authorized to spy on opposition political parties and do so with great thoroughness. Organizations must receive prior approval from the police for demonstrations and even meetings and conferences that might draw international participation. The origins of this kind of policing run deep in the colonial centers that bred it. We can see this clearly in the context of the transition from autocratic to more modern liberal policing in the 19th century. The imperial powers of Europe each had secret police that spied on, interrogated, imprisoned, and at times tortured political opponents and infiltrated and subverted the movements of workers, ethnic minorities, and even liberal reformers. France has had several forms of policing going back to the Middle Ages. As the size and complexity of Paris increased, it was necessary for the ancient regime to extend and professionalize its mechanisms of social control. In 1666, Louis XIV created a lieutenant of police whose chief duties were to provide intelligence to the crown and maintain public order, including suppressing riots and political movements, but this organization failed to predict or prevent the uprisings that led to the French Revolution. Hold on, let me get something to drink real quick. I'm going to try to be more open about that. Sometimes it'd be like pauses within the podcast and I'm getting something to drink and I'm just trying to like not vocalize that. But I had to get something to drink. After the revolution, the new Ministry of Police became more civilian, but no less political. Despite a rhetorical emphasis on enforcing the law, the police became a tool of whichever faction was in power, focusing primarily on la haute police, or the high policing of politics. Under Napoleon, the police were further professionalized and integrated more clearly into a modern legal system capable of providing daily intelligence reports of conditions across the country, which were forwarded to him during his foreign military adventures. The military the military gendarmerie policed the countryside, while municipal police were responsible for the cities. At the center was a massive intelligence operation, the Directory, engaged in political intrigue, surveillance, and censorship. Today, both the rural gendarmerie and national police play a central role in domestic intelligence gathering, giving rise to the saying that, quote, French citizens are free to do as they choose under police supervision, end quote. However, policing in liberal democratic settings has been no less political. The British police, whose origins are discussed in detail in Chapter 2, regularly engage in surveillance and subversion of domestic political movements. During the 1960s and 1970s, they infiltrated labor unions, universities, and peace organizations, pressured members for information about subversives and foreign agents, and raided them to seek political information. In 2011, during the Occupy Wall Street movement, police in the city of Westminster circulated a notice to local businesses and individuals asking them to report any signs of the presence of, quote, anarchists, end quote, to the police counterterrorism desk immediately, side by side with notices about Al-Qaeda. In the absence of any evidence or even allegation of criminal activity, the police routinely collect information on political activists whose philosophy runs counter to existing political arrangements. The 2011 incident was tied to Project Griffin, which was designed to, quote, advise and familiarize managers, security officers, and employees of large public and private sector organizations across the Capitol on security, counterterrorism, and crime prevention issues, end quote. These projects involve a disturbing trend in which local police are asked to provide security updates for the private sector about the threat of demonstrations, essentially political threat assessment. Such briefings tend to report past criminal and terrorist activity, vague assessments of broad international trends, or micro-reporting of loose bits of unconnected and distant tidbits, such as a suspected terrorist in Pakistan being found with a map of the London subway on his laptop. Police infiltrators in the United Kingdom have targeted peace, animal rights, environmental, and anarchist groups, and undercover detectives have had sexual relationships with women in these movements. There are some estimates that more than 100 women have been victimized. In at least one case, the relationship produced a child, resulting in a settlement of close to $1 million. That agent, Bob Lambert, was implicated in planting and setting off explosive devices in department stores selling fur coats in order to deepen his acceptance into the extremist wing of the animal rights movement and justify continued police infiltration and disruption, the very definition of an agent provocateur. And that brings us to a changing of the theme within the chapter, political policing. So let's have a reflection. So this is the most direct that we've talked about, the role that politics plays within policing. And I think that some of the things that stand out here, again, he goes through and he takes us to different countries and the way that policing and the institution of policing affects politics in other countries around the world. Before what is going to be ultimately in this next passage, what's going to be ultimately us in this next passage, speaking about how policing on the political front affects us here in the United States. But I think that, again, we want to take all these things in conjunction with each other. And so just as we've seen the flaws that exist in border policing in other countries and policing sex work and drug trade in other countries, we see here the corruption and the negative aspects that exist in policing, in political policing in countries outside of America. And I think the question that must be asked when we start speaking about political policing is the motives. And I think that this specific type of policing is one that where the motives are more cut and dry, are more black and white. It's easier to identify. It's harder to identify the motives, the political motives that lie in gang suppression or that lie in the drug war on drugs or homelessness. And, some of these other things have these other layers to them that makes it difficult to sort of understand or to connect it to politics. And with this, you see how at the very beginning, when we go to each one of these different countries and learn about the policing, the political policing that exists there, you see people being opponents of whatever the regime is that is in place are being disappeared or being kidnapped or being killed. People who are vocal against the powers that are in place, people who are protest were. Let me see. I'm sort of like double talking here. So I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that when you read about the first 9 chapters of this book, it's very easy to read these things, and for the first thing you have to grapple with, or first thing you have to challenge an ideology is somebody's moral beliefs or somebody's ethical beliefs. But once you get to this chapter, it becomes about specifically their ideological beliefs, their political beliefs. It's not about their morality or their ethics anymore. Those things have been pushed out the window. So when you hear about protest, people who are involved in protest, or people that are involved in organizations that are fighting against whatever the current government is, or when they use a term like anarchist, it's clear that this is about people who have a different belief system, and because of that different belief system, they are being criminalized. They are not being criminalized because of an act that's being done or because of somebody's moral belief that what these people are doing is having a negative impact on society as a whole or a place as a whole. It's strictly because of what these people's beliefs are. And I think that makes this a form of policing that's easier to get across to people as being wrong. It's for some people, because of their morals or because of their ethics or because they have never been challenged on some of these things we're speaking about, it's harder to get them to understand, or it's harder to have that conversation about how this form of policing is wrong. And with this, it's a little bit more straight to the point. Even when they start speaking about how the less liberal, the less democratic of some of these countries, the more overt the violence is by the police. You know, the type of spying and espionage that goes on by the police in the form of politics. The false imprisonment, you know, some of those things are easier to get across to people as being wrong. And so I guess that's just what I took away from that first couple of pages. And I do think it's important to take something away from a couple of pages. I think it's important to read something and then take some time and be like, okay, how does this resonate with me? How does this fit into the scope of everything else that I'm reading? Especially when you're reading something for a purpose. Political policing at home. Despite our concerns about political liberty, the U.S. police have a long history of similarly abusive practices. The myth of policing in a liberal democracy is that the police exist to prevent political activity that crosses the line into criminal activity, such as property destruction and violence. But they have always focused on detecting and disrupting movements that threaten the economic and political status quo, regardless of the presence of criminality. While on a few occasions this has included actions against the far right, it has overwhelmingly focused on the left, especially those movements tied to workers and racial minorities and those challenging American foreign policy. More recently, focus has shifted to surveillance of Muslims as part of the war on terror. In 1908, the Justice Department created the Bureau of Investigation, BOI, which was headed by J. Edgar Hoover in 1924. Hoover turned the BOI and later the FBI, created in 1935, into a massive domestic intelligence gathering operation with files on millions of Americans, including politicians, political activists, and celebrities. The rise of the modern federal intelligence gathering was driven initially by concerns over anarchists and, quote, Reds, end quote, who were implicated in waves of strikes, bombings, and assassinations in the early part of the century. From the assassination of President McKinley in 1901 to the bombings of the Los Angeles Times in 1910 and Wall Street in 1920, leading to a wave of reprisals targeting anyone with anarchist affiliations, wobblies, and in most cases, Italian labor activists of any political stripe. Hold on, let me get some water. In the wake of the Russian Revolution, a massive wave of, quote, Red Scare, end quote, gripped the country. Revolutionary groups did exist across the U.S., but their influence was largely ideological rather than organizational. They produced numerous newspapers and leaflets, but had little connection to actual unions. This did not prevent the Justice Department from collecting files on them. Hoover's BOI claimed to have a card catalog with over 200,000 entries of suspected, quote, Reds, end quote. Following a wave of suspicious bombings in 1919, surveillance turned to subversion, despite the fact that Hoover's own records made clear that none of these organizations was involved in orchestrating violence or were in any position to stage an armed insurrection. The two, quote, most dangerous, end quote, anarchist groups surveilled had a total membership of 37. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a major national campaign to disrupt any movement sympathetic to socialism, communism, or anarchism in 1919. He relied on new, more restrictive immigration laws that allowed for the deportation of anyone espousing the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. He argued that anyone who was a member of an organization that supported the Soviet Revolution was making such an espousal, even when the group formally adhered to a strategy of nonviolent political change. These became known as the Palmer Raids. which began with the rounding up and deportation of a few hundred left writers and activists, including Emma Goldman in 1919, even though she was a naturalized American citizen. In January 1920, Palmer, working with local police, undertook a massive campaign of arrests, interrogation, false imprisonment, and deportation. Thousands were arrested. Go fuck yourself, you racist prick! Thank you. Have a good night. Sorry about that. My fault. Let's see. Where was we at? In January 1920, Palmer, working with local police, undertook a massive campaign of arrest, interrogation, false imprisonment, and deportation. Thousands were arrested, including large numbers of U.S. citizens. Journalists were specially targeted, files seized, and papers closed down. Many were held for weeks in basements and building hallways with no access to bathrooms, food, or lawyers. Many others were beaten or tortured, and in one instance, a prisoner, quote, jumped, end quote, out of a window and died. Buffalo's police chief was quoted as saying, quote, "It's too bad we can't line them up against the wall and shoot them," end quote. The Massachusetts Secretary of State said, quote, "If I had my way, I would take them out in the yard every morning and shoot them, and the next day would have a trial to see whether they were guilty," end quote. In the end, the raids were found to be utterly illegal, but not before hundreds were deported, organizations disrupted, and lives destroyed. While the avowed focus was on preventing armed revolution, the real target was the disruption of burgeoning labor movement. Burgeoning labor movement. I know what that word means, but I don't know if I pronounced it right. In addition, Palmer singled out groups that supported equal rights for African Americans for public attack, such as the Communist Party, which, to his horror, told, quote, Negroes, end quote, that they had the right to strike. Okay, let's take a moment to reflect right there. So I think the thing that stands out the most from those passages is the Palmer raids. And I think that once you understand the Palmer raids and some of the precedent that was set in the early 1900s, you begin to understand why the mid-1900s and why the civil rights movement was attacked in the way that it was attacked. The country had, during the 1900s with the Palmer raids and the Red Scare and with the stigmatization that went around communism, had equipped the country to vilify anybody who had political beliefs that did not fall directly in line with mainstream America and whatever the beliefs of mainstream America was at the time. So anybody who did not have a belief system that supported racism, those people would be vilified. Anybody that did not have a belief system that supported segregation, those people would be vilified. Anybody that didn't have a political belief system that supported black people and people of color being second-class citizens, they would be vilified. Anybody who had a belief system to have livable wages and to have equal income and to have better living conditions, like all of these people were vilified just based off the fact that they had differing political beliefs. And so doing that in the early 1900s made it so that by the time you get to the civil rights movements in the 1950s, 1960s, there was already a system that was set in place to crush any type of political opposition. And they had hardened it through the early and mid 20th century. All right, let's keep going. In the wake of the abuses of the Palmer raids, the FBI was initially somewhat constrained in its political activities, focusing primarily on intelligence gathering. American concerns about an over-powerful state meant that there was some limited oversight of their activities by Congress, which placed some checks on their most egregious practices. They continued, however, to play a role in identifying and intimidating, quote, known communists, end quote, during the McCarthy period. In the 1960s, the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, is now known to have kept files on millions of lawful activists and engaged in the active disruption of movement organizations through false letters, infiltrators, and the use of agent provocateurs. Notable figures like Martin Luther King had their phones tapped. FBI agents often attended meetings either covertly or overtly to take notes for intelligence files and use their conspicuous presence as a form of intimidation. They planted informants within organizations to collect information, but also to sow dissension, make false allegations against people, and at times, suggest violent courses of action to entrap and discredit organizations and their leaders. Unfortunately, there were few checks on the activities of local police. Frank Donner, in his exhaustive history of local, quote, red squads, end quote, shows how America's large police forces dedicated significant resources to political policing, and that this policing was closely tied to far-right politics, private business interests, and corruption. As immigration and industrialization transformed the economic and social landscape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, local police were increasingly involved in suppressive workers' movements. Up until the 1930s, there was no real right to form a union or strike in the U.S. Union activists were routinely fired, driven out of town, and sometimes killed by either company agents or police. Strikes were put down through threats, the use of scabs, and when necessary, violence. Early in this period, much of this work was done by private security companies such as the Pinkertons, who were implicated in numerous beatings, shootings, and infiltrations of unions, including the Homestead Strike of 1892, in which guards and workers squared off in a gun battle that killed several on both sides, prompting the calling out of the local militia who crushed the strikers and their union. By the 1930s, the Pinkerton Agency had over 1,300 spies embedded in various unions in an effort to disrupt their activities on behalf of employers. In most places, local police played a major role in suppressing strikes. Often this was done through a process of political corruption in which police were beholden to local elected officials who did much of the hiring and firing of police, especially at the top ranks. In many places in the 19th and early 20th centuries, police were directly appointed by local politicians on the basis of political services and substantial bribes. These local officials were often beholden to large employers through bribery and political favors. When these employers were faced with labor unrest, they need only call on local police to suppress the strike, break up meetings, and intimidate and brutalize alleged, quote, ringleaders, end quote. As labor unrest and violence grew near the turn of the century, special squads were formed in most major cities. Much of the initial focus was on alleged anarchists, who were believed to play the most militant role in labor strife and were associated with numerous bombings and assassinations. Police began keeping large systems of files on suspected anarchists and other labor radicals. The Wobblies of the International Workers of the World, IWW, were among the most frequent targets of surveillance and harassment. Meetings were disrupted and suspected anarchists were often arrested, sometimes on trumped-up charges, as in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were executed in 1927. In the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, attention turned to, quote, Reds, end quote, as communist agents and sympathizers became the primary obsession of employers, political leaders, and police hoping to find a way to suppress the growing labor movement. Red squads flourished after World War I. They generally operated in secret and in close collusion with local employers and Hoover's BOI. In many cases, detectives who helped to break up strikes were given large, unreported cash bonuses from employers, just one of the many forms of corruption to emerge from this system of secretive political policing. Employers also often provided cash to pay for informants and infiltrators. This system blurred the line between public and private interest and undermined the core ideals of an independent police under the control of elected civilian governments. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Red Squads played an important role in the blacklisting of anyone suspected of ties to communism. While the FBI played a role in this process, it was largely supplanted by local police, who increasingly shared information with each other and provided information directly to congressional committees working to expose communists inside government and the labor movement. In 1956, a new independent agency, the Law Enforcement Intelligence Unit, was created to share files among police agencies concerning organized crime and political activity. Though funded in part by federal grants, they maintained that they were a private entity and thus not subject to any kind of government oversight or accountability. This agency still exists. Let's see where we're at. All right, we only got like a page and a half left of this specific segment, so let's try to get through this. We probably end up about 40 minutes this episode. Hold on, let me get something to drink. And what I think is important about the passages we just read is just the emphasis that it's putting on highlighting the way that labor unions were policed and the way that police were involved in the politics of labor and the politics of employer versus employee. And so I just think that that's something that's important to point out, because it shows you the way that the police are used to maintain the capitalist status quo. Because as we talk about some of these things when we get to the 1960s and 1950s, 1970s, you see how they are being used specifically to maintain the status quo of racism. And especially now that is something that we've talked about heavily, part of the status quo they're maintaining is one that is rooted in racism. But racism in this country came along with capitalism because of the fact that the land was a form of capital, and the people who originally were in this land, indigenous people of this land, were people of color. And so they were able to attach those two things together, their racism and their capitalism, because the first workers that were in this country were human beings that were turned into slaves and were turned into seen as property. And because just them, I read a book called I can't think of the name of the book right now, I'm sorry. But in the book, it spoke about how since Africans were considered to be property and were slaves, that running away wasn't just a form of escaping slavery, it was also stealing property. And I bring that up to say, so the first real labor dispute that took place in this country was between Africans and the Europeans who were enslaving them. And that was, again, tied into their race. These were black people. And so I think that it's just as important as it is for us to understand the political policing that's connected to racism. It's also important to understand the political policing as it is connected to capitalism. By the 1960s, the focus shifted to the civil rights movement, peace activists, and radical students. Red Squads again developed massive systems of files to keep track of the growing movements. While the vast majority of participants in these movements were nonviolent, police used the fact that people were arrested and that violence occurred in connection with these movements to justify surveillance and eventually active subversion. This despite the fact that the arrest and violence were often the result of discriminatory police action rather than actual criminal wrongdoing. While the federal counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, worked to subvert the civil rights movement, it was police in Los Angeles, Chicago, New Orleans, and other cities who staged raids of Black Panther chapters, killing and imprisoning many of its local and national leaders. It was local police who violently suppressed anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in Chicago, New York, and Washington, and beat and imprisoned civil rights activists in Birmingham, Selma, and Montgomery, Alabama. In 1971, a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and uncovered COINTELPRO, including documents showing attempts to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide through sexual extortion. Through a series of high-profile congressional hearings, local investigations, as well as numerous lawsuits that followed, the public began to learn more about the secret networks of political spies, of police spies. Some departments were forced to hand over files, others destroyed or attempted to hide them. As recently as 2016, the NYPD claimed to have lost a room full of documents ordered preserved by the court about its spying operations in the 1960s and 1970s. Through a series of court orders, local laws, and federal intervention, many red squads were shut down and others were given much tighter constraints on their actions. Court settlements resulted in restrictions and oversight. Intelligence units were required to restrict their activities to cases where there were actual evidence of criminal activity being planned or committed, with approval required to undertake undercover work or hire informants. In some cases, independent auditors were empowered to review files. Photographing and videotaping people involved lawful protest, activity, or participating in political gatherings were restricted. These reforms, while important in exposing and limiting the extent of political policing, were temporary and incomplete. Part of the problem is that any criminal activity is sufficient to trigger an investigation. Since civil disobedience actions have become a mainstay of social movement activity, almost all social movements participate in some form of technically illegal activity. Intelligence units continue to view monitoring political activity as part of their mandate. Since 9/11, however, police have rehabilitated their intelligence gathering infrastructure under the cover of terrorism prevention. In New York, the NYPD went to court to try to water down its consent decree. The handshoe agreement that planted significant restrictions on surveillance practices. The court allowed it to resume photographing demonstrators, even though there is almost no conceivable connection between protest and terrorism. They were also allowed to use informants and undercover agents with little to no oversight. NYPD agents collected broad intelligence against activists protesting the Republican National Convention in New York in 2004, including organizers, independent journalists, and well-known organizations with no history of violence. Those who were arrested were subjected to interrogation about their political beliefs, organizational affiliations, and social networks. After the New York Civil Liberties Union exposed the practice, the NYPD voluntarily agreed to stop it. However, in 2015, activists arrested as part of the Black Lives Matter movement reported similar standardized political interrogations. In 2010, the ACLU found hundreds of incidents of police spying on legal political and protest activity in 33 states since 2001. In 2003, Oakland police infiltrated an anti-police brutality organization and played an active role in planning and coordinating events, including the route of a march. This represents a fundamental conflict of interest and abuse of police power and crosses the line from passive observation into active manipulation. The impropriety is compounded by the fact that the target of these demonstrations was the police themselves. All right, that brings us to the end of that theme within the chapter. And that was a lot. That last part was a lot. I think, again, Alex Vitale does a great job of starting us back into the origins of whatever the form of policing is, and then bringing us to how it affects us in present times. And so we were able to see how the emphasis shifted from spying and infiltrating labor unions in the labor struggle to spying and infiltrating on the civil rights movement and the civil rights struggle, and then to closer to present times, and in present times, spying and infiltrating anti-police movement, the abolishment of police movement, the abolishment of police struggle, what we call here is a struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And each one of these periods of time, this specific issue poses a threat not to people's safety, but poses a threat to what the status quo is. It poses a threat to the elite that are in power based on the system that's at hand, or based on the institution that is in control. And so here again, we just see it heightens and highlights the fact that the institution of policing is something that is heavily concerned with control. It's concerned with the control of people more than it's concerned with the protection of people or the serving of people. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I appreciate it, brother. Yeah, yeah. Take it easy. Stay safe out here, bro. Yep. And and so I think that's one of the things that's important to point out about that. And then I think one of the other things that we see here too is think about the how you doing, man? Think about the amount of money and resources that the government was allowing the police and their and these different organizations to put into spying, to put into subversion, to put into these efforts of not stopping criminals, not stopping people who were victimizing anybody, but just trying to stop people who had different political beliefs. And I think, again, that's where you get into the understanding of the hypocrisies and of these institutions and why it's not simple, why you can't just reform these institutions. I think that's what stands out the most by the time you get to this chapter is that you see all of these different ways that this institution devalues human beings, that this institution exploits and oppresses human beings. And it's at that point that you realize there's nothing to be saved here. You keep on trying to cut off one limb or cut off one branch to save the whole of the tree, just to find out that every branch that grows from it is corrupted because the seed and the trunk, the base of the tree is corrupted. And we see here also that within political policing, they use all these other laws that they have created in these other forms of policing to suppress these movements and to criminalize these people. You see, we read about border policing, and we read now in political policing how deportation is used as a weapon. We read about before in the war on drugs, they spoke about during Nixon's campaign that their biggest enemies were the blacks and the anti-war left. Basically the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And they couldn't just summarily lock people up for being for civil rights and against war. So what they did is they connected them with drugs. They propagandized that people in these movements were drug users, so then they could arrest them under those pretenses, vilify them under those pretenses. And so we're going to end this episode here. We had almost about 45 minutes, so this is a longer episode. We will continue reading about political policing on the next episode of Rockford Reading Daily. Please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember that we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin and further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Talk to you tomorrow.